Welcome to the Love Conscious Human Podcast, your launch pad to cultivate and elevate your personal power. I'm your host, business strategist, and leadership coach, Dr. Teri. Let's have fun and jump right in.
Hello, Love Conscious Humans. Thank you for being with us here today. We have a special guest here, Jamee, who works with me with the Love Conscious Human Tribe. Today, she's coming on to talk to us a little bit about her thoughts with the book Flip Your Switch. First, though, Jamee, can you introduce yourself to our listeners here and let them know, who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Teri. It's really, really good to be here. And I always love our conversations, whether they're recorded or not. My name is Jamee. I live in the Boston area. And as well as being a media person, assistant to Teri in her work with Love Conscious Human, I also teach classes in Tai Chi, Qigong, meditation, and the Alexander technique. I also train others to become teachers and practitioners, and I have been doing so for many decades now. It's a great path to walk, and it only ever began once I started to address myself as a whole being, which I didn't know anything about that. And then all of a sudden you're on the holistic path because of certain issue that came up in my body. And so I'm very excited to talk about your book. There's a couple of chapters. It was hard to decide which one to talk about, but maybe I'll thread some ideas together based on what I've read. It's a wonderful book. I hope everybody gets a chance to get a copy. Flip Your Switch, a user's guide to a whole new mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, tell us, what is itching for you to talk about? Which chapters or chapters are you most interested in talking about today?
Yeah. Well, I thought today I was going to focus on chapters 10 and 11. They're twins. Number 10 is the anatomy of hate. Number 11 is the anatomy of love. And from that Tai Chi perspective, it's kind of like the yin yang symbol, where you encompass seeming opposites within the circle of one.
Right.
Right. So it's important to understand both war consciousness and love consciousness, because I think in my earlier years, anything that wasn't pleasant, including my own frustration, my own anger, I wanted to get rid of it. But I didn't know that I could have this alchemical process within myself where I could neutralize the extremes of those feelings and understand them as information, perhaps even a message from my body, from my psyche, from my higher power, my daemon, as you call it in your book. And that has been the unfolding of myself realizing myself as a whole human being. But it started with, hey, you have a health problem, you need surgery, or go ahead, get a second opinion. So luckily I went to get a second opinion, and that doctor was a Western doctor, but really encompassed a holistic mindset and person. The first question she asked me was, what do you do for creativity? And so mind blown, totally shift in understanding of doctors as authority and, whatever you say is right. This second opinion opened up my world. And coincidentally, at the same time, I met someone who became a teacher for me, who had also been through a health crisis. And then she walked a path towards wholeness. And so it was just fascinating that those came together truly within the same month,
Yeah.
So part of that growth was to learn to see that my entire emotional landscape was to be embraced, not gotten rid of, right? So that I could learn to listen to my fear, listen to my own anger, and learn to have some awareness of how I was directing my consciousness,
Yeah.
which I didn't even know I had one really at the time, you know.
Right.
So that's a question I have for you that we could share in this conversation, because you lay out consciousness in these seemingly opposing ways, but in fact, you also say no, it's right within your left and right brain. So you have
Yeah.
one brain in your head, but there's these aspects of the brain, distinctions. So can I ask you, what is consciousness?
So in the book, when I use war consciousness and great question, by the way. When I use war consciousness and love consciousness, it does seem dualistic in the beginning, and that's part of the learning process.
Mhm.
It's not until part 3 in the book where you mentioned the daemon and such that you start to understand that there's like this other thing where it actually becomes much more whole.
Mhm.
Um, but the war consciousness is awareness. Like, what is the perspective?
Mhm.
Like, how are you looking at something? How are you interpreting it?
Mhm.
So something very simple. If we look at it like the word hope, from love consciousness, we have hope and we give hope,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
From war consciousness, hope is nothing more than a carrot that we dangle in front of people to get them to do what we want.
Mhm.
In negotiation, we call that keeping someone on the dangle.
Mhm.
We use hope, and then we keep moving the carrot so that they continue to have hope. And so we weaponize hope
Mhm.
from the
Mhm.
war conscious point of view.
Mhm.
And so, and again, when we're talking about the 2 chapters, Anatomy of Hate and Anatomy of Love, it's also this is in the first part of the book. And so it's really understanding how hate and love show up in the world
Mhm.
and being able to identify war consciousness and love consciousness. Because it's not an obvious thing. Just because
Mhm.
someone's nice doesn't mean that they're love conscious.
Right. And that's a great example you put up through your own painful experience of the martial arts school that was welcomed you. Yes, please pay your membership. Give us money to join our club. You don't say
Oh,
that. I'm slipping that in because
yeah.
it's all nice when you want to be a new member, but as soon as they determined that you weren't fitting in or you went beyond where they are, perhaps with the spiritual awakening that you write about, then all of a sudden, you're excluded. Any teacher, especially, sorry, I've been in the martial arts world for a long time. Any teacher that is going to break you down like that um, has lost his center or her center. Okay. To be able to maintain your center in anything, whether it's an actual sparring match where you have physical contact with someone, or you're sitting back and you're observing something and you're wanting to convey a message from the martial arts honor code of grounding, centering, quiet your mind. It's almost like you had your own sparring going on with the psyche and you flipped them and they landed on their butt and didn't know what to do about it. So you can have psychological sparring. It's a kung fu match and you can throw people, but it's not a good integrity. And good on you for not naming them because you're just using the story to make an example, but you didn't have to name them and badmouth them.
Well, I
Um,
think, yeah, the whole experience was wonderful and horrific all at the same time.
mhm.
But and it did trigger a spiritual awakening, but it also triggered a fundamental, like that mind-blowing emoji kind of
Mhm.
moment in my life
Mhm.
where I really came to understand this war consciousness.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because coming mostly from like what I consider to be predominantly love consciousness in my life, and being very spiritual and always speaking, seeking spiritual elevation, I really didn't understand clearly that there were people who could really live from this win, lose, right, wrong, I'm up, you're down, and that they would have such a strong capture, contain, control, and even kill mindset. It was just like I couldn't fathom it. And then afterwards, when I started to like get the breakdown in my mind of what this was in my life, I expanded out, where in that chapter I talk about scapegoating and I talk about black sheeping and exclusion, the very function of excluding as making someone other. And I'm like, and then I just like, it was like this explosion. I even like, for several months, I cried. I cried just because I was looking at the world, understanding what it meant to be used, abused, and discarded. And I thought, oh my God, this is what people are doing so much all of the time, and how we have institutionalized this action, this way of being, this way of perceiving, this way of being. This isn't, and then it was like, wow, this is everywhere. And I had their misbehavior was good in a way for me to see who they are.
Yeah, some of the hardest lessons are pretty simple, but they hurt the most. And this came from teachers who you opened yourself to learn. So that, I've been through that before in a different way, and it just shows me who I don't want to be. Now, one of the things you wrote in the chapter was singling out an individual as bad, treating them with contempt, blaming them for the dysfunctions of the group, and throwing them out was for them a technique to improve the quality of the group through exclusion. But it was an expression of how they function. To consider themselves exclusive, they needed to exclude. And you were excluded because you were being something you weren't supposed to be in order to keep them comfortable. That's a really good point. People will deflect their own defaults of character, if you will, to take that from the 12-step program. If they're not owning their stuff, they're going to deflect it out. And if you were a mirror for that and they couldn't handle it, or their egos were too, rigid that they couldn't find that vulnerability within themselves, good for you for crying for a couple months, I don't want to be really generalized, because I know some incredibly strong, masculine, sensitive men, but most men would not reveal the vulnerability of their weakness at all, sometimes not even to themselves. And, when it comes to the ego, that's also, we have an ego, so we understand that I am a separate person from Teri. I have skin, she has skin, there's space in between, right? But if we just let it sit there, then we don't have to let the ego rule and be the boss.
True. Oh. And I think there's also like an illusion around ego, because we think of the ego as the self, but it's not. The self is something, there's many layers to the self and all of that. And the ego is just one little part.
Yeah.
And it's that very scared part that's defending a lot.
Yes, defending. Yeah. Yeah. So I think as a person goes along their path, just recognizing that much about the ego, is enough to say, oh, wait a minute. I'm defending, so I'm behind this wall, operating more in the war consciousness. And because I'm aware of that, love consciousness is speaking to me. Yeah, right. For an example, if a person is anxious and they're feeling anxiety, how do they know? Right? They have the experience of nervousness, tightness, and the inability to speak, nice hot flush at times. But yeah, those are the consequences of anxiety, but they know they're they're anxious because there's an aspect of themselves that notices.
That's what I like to refer to as the higher self or the
The
daemon.
higher self, right?
I mean, Deepak Chopra would call that like the witness. There's
Yeah.
many names for it in many traditions.
Yeah.
But it is that part of us that can actually observe the other parts.
Yes. And that part, the higher self, the higher you, is not anxious. Right? So that there's the goal. There you are, anxious, fingers, fists rubbing, nervous, but you notice it. Oh, who is that that's noticing? If you could bring more curiosity there, then you start to tap in to that higher self that's coming from a sense of the whole, not the part that's anxious. And that is where we tap into the anatomy of love. And by the way, I love these titles: the anatomy of hatred, the anatomy of love, the anatomy of your physical body, because it lives within it.
Yeah. And I think also like the the term anatomy tries to say there's a structure to this that is pretty much universal. We all have an anatomy. And so the anatomy of hate has characteristics. It's the war consciousness: win, lose, capture, contain, and control. I'm in charge, control, and eventually even destroy. And from that space, everything is kind of dead. It's just stuff. People are stuff. Like in the martial arts studio, I was a piece of stuff called student. They could extract money from me. They could get me to do stuff, be in a certain way. And then I didn't conform. And then I became disposable, unwanted, and then that's when I became the useless old woman and all of the names that they called me. And then eventually they kicked me out. Which is, and made it my fault, of course, because there was something wrong with me. We don't want you to be in our thing anymore. So, but that is all of those characteristics are war conscious. But if you have those things happening inside you or around you, you know that that's what's happening. And the point is to be able to identify what's happening so you can be at choice.
Learn to identify it. I think I learned along my way that those so-called negative emotions were just more of two sides of the pole, meaning, the extremes. So let's say you have war consciousness, love consciousness. It's the same wand, if you will. If you're going to make a horizontal line, you'd have war on one side, love on the other, and somewhere in the middle, there's a neutrality, right? I had to learn to embrace the so-called negative emotions and, in fact, put them inside my lower dantian. This is an area of the body for transformation and energetic grounding and acceptance. And through the transformation, is no longer owning me, right? If I was trying to get rid of the anger or the sadness, the grief, it was owning me because it was in the background or it was stuffed down, etc. So the more I learned to embrace that, and it's just an aspect of myself, In fact, it's wisdom and information, and it's sacred. The emotions are sacred. It's information. What is my body trying to tell me through my emotional sense? because that usually shows up somewhere in your body too. You know, your throat gets tight, or your fists all of a sudden are clenching, things like that, or you start crying, right? But that's wisdom, that's information. And learning to accept that, embrace that, meant I was no longer going to be acting out to the external world. I could then take it in within myself and say, wow, something is really happening and it's not lining up with my value system. And therefore I feel irked or, bothered by it. Okay. But it's all mine. It's all my experience. It doesn't have anything to do with really what happened around me, except for the news of it. But it's me that is responding. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm the one that's either reacting or responding. So by embracing, some people call it the dark side, right?
Yeah, but I think also like there's a role for anger. There's a role for separating oneself from someone who's basically hurting you.
Yes. Yes.
And again, it's understanding the being at choice. And the war consciousness, as you evolve, actually dissolves. That's something that we have to understand. Like once the daemon emerges, in the elevation of the human, there is a point where that what we would think of as war consciousness just becomes left brain, tactical, practical function. Like, oh, I need to decide when I buy this plane ticket, what's the better price here? No, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And that's like that's just the practical tactical of what's happening. There's not and that's when the love consciousness is basically stronger. And it is the nature of all things. That, and then within that, you have right brain function, which is the creative, the connecting, the comprehending multiple dimensional thinking and all of that happening. So we really have to understand that these are not a fixed duality.
Right. It's all one circle.
It's all one thing in the end.
Yeah.
It's just understanding, well, which consciousness do I want to have leading my life? That is our choice point. And so the more you lean into love consciousness, the more you live there. The more you lean into war consciousness, the more you live there. Where do you want to live?
Right. That is where you want to live. Where do you want to come from? Where do you want to communicate from? Where do you want to dream from? And it's not a denial of the war consciousness. You just start using it differently, like you just described. It could be more of the analytical thinking, working on your checkbook, your calendar. Yeah, they are part of the whole. And as I mentioned earlier, since I'm a Tai Chi person, the yin yang circle has the two fishes, either black or white or blue or red. You see in the symbols, right? And those are considered opposites, like day and night, male, female, etc., up, down. But they're within the circle. That whole symbol starts with a circle. That's the circle of unity. That's why I say they're seemingly opposite. But within that circle, you have your preferences of what you like, what you don't like. And that is more of that horizontal interaction back and forth between me and the stimulus of the world or the news or anything, or even within myself. But if you recall that it is within the circle of one, that unity, spirit or consciousness, aspect of being an existence, right? We are existing within an existence. We're existing within the whole of life, after all, right?
Exactly.
So it takes you from the small concerns to the larger, without losing respect for the preferences that a person has, which does change over time. Yeah.
So when with the anatomy of love,
Yep.
which you just talked about oneness. So
Yeah.
That
Well,
is,
the first thing I notice here is that you went into the yoga studio and they welcomed you. Now, so did the martial arts people, but then they changed and they showed their true colors. And these people didn't also show their true colors, but not by changing, by deepening the welcoming. So that's a very clear example of people who are, I guess, walking their talk, rather than be in this place of competition.
right, right. I think it's even beyond competition. I think it's a place of conflict.
Yeah,
I think that people who are leading from more consciousness, leading their lives from more consciousness, need to compete and
right,
need to exclude.
right.
Um, they do that in order, I think, in order to alleviate their own internal sense of not enough. Like they need to exclude to feel exclusive.
Right.
So,
You need to win, win, win.
well, you have to, and so there needs to be a conflict. So when you win, then that makes you better. And of course, we know that those kinds of wins or achievements are just tiny momentary blips,
Yeah,
and that you need to get another one. It's sort of like you're jonesing for the next one, and
right.
there's no end to it. It's a form of addiction.
Yeah.
And but when I went into the yoga studio, it took a while for me to actually trust that they were sincere.
Yeah. Yeah. I bet. Yeah.
But also what I remember very much is they said wonderful things to me, but they said lots of wonderful personal things to everybody.
Right. You weren't being sectioned out. Yeah.
Nobody was.
Yeah.
Nobody was. And at the same time, everyone had a pretty much uniqueness.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of openness and uniqueness.
Mm-hmm.
And the teachers in this yoga studio didn't need to prove anything. They were
Yeah.
not trying to prove. And that was another thing I was like, they're not, and they were not into the stardom things that some yoga teachers are.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't, they're trying to be a very successful business, which they were,
Mm-hmm.
but they said clearly we're trying to form a community, and they were connected to all kinds of different things. They would take donations for other organizations as
Right.
well. So
Right.
the inclusivity
Yeah.
and the bandwidth that
Mm.
they had
Mm.
to include other people
Mm.
was, for me in that moment of time, was incredible. It's like, how do they have the bandwidth to like
Yeah.
authentically include
Mm-hmm.
happily
Mm-hmm.
all these other people without feeling threatened?
Right. Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah. Because that's the healing, right? And it sounds like they're really walking their talk for what the ethos of yoga is all about, which, I've heard said the highest form of martial arts is Tai Chi. Okay. Now, not many people can reach a high level of Tai Chi, and that's okay. But it has to do with understanding the union of things. And so you're not in a combative situation. You really, really know and embody your own energy, so you can see when energy is being messed with, and then you know what to do before the person even does it. So that's a high level of mastery. What I love is that you're bringing this whole awareness into the business world, because businesses that can, embrace the diversity of their employees for one, they're in a customer base for another, which at this point in the world, it's global for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Then success will come from within that self-development, and in particular the leaders, we hope, um, so go for it, Teri. I mean, keep on your mission. That's why I like supporting you within the Love Conscious Human company and ethos, and because we've got our work cut out for us. And I
Yeah.
think just learn. People just learn, study, listen, learn, observe, get a mentor, have a teacher, whether to help you with these personal conversations this growth, or a teacher that can offer a transmission of energy so that you can have your own awakening. It's a worthy path, I guess it is what I'm saying. It's a
Yeah.
worthy path.
I do like that leadership development now is leaning much more into the wisdom traditions. And we do see more, we do see more things like Qigong on
Yeah.
leadership retreats
That's great. Yeah.
and meditation on
Mhm.
leadership retreats,
Mhm.
because we're coming to a point where in order for us to do well, and
Mhm.
business is how we deal, like
Mhm.
that's so much of what we do in a day is that, that exchange or transaction. And again, that's tricky because when we're in war consciousness, it's transaction in business.
Yes.
About exploitation and extraction for
Mm.
me, for the company, whatever, for
Mhm.
profit.
From
And
the
that's
earth. Mhm.
when we're in love conscious, it's like, oh, this is an exchange. Same thing
Mhm.
happening. It's an
Mhm.
exchange,
Mhm.
but it's not just about the profit. It's about all of the shareholders and that are, all this, the stakeholders, all of the people that are involved, customers, but the planet too, and all this other. So it's a much more complex,
Mhm.
holistic
Mhm.
mindset. So leaders need to understand
Mhm.
this whole new mindset.
Mhm.
So we need more leaders who can have, and I'm not saying they need to go get religion, not at all. There are
Yeah.
these basic principles
Mhm.
of war consciousness and love consciousness that go over any tradition you can find in there.
Yeah, you don't have to, come up with something to believe in. You have to learn to be more aware of what you've got already,
Yes.
right? You've got your left brain, you've got your right brain, you've got your war consciousness competition, you've got your ability to love and have compassion for yourself and others, and see that maybe the product that you have can serve the needs of a population of sorts, and you have come from that, then there's great gratification in offering it
Right.
instead of just being salesy,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. I think that's where we've come to understand that um it's the person. Leaders are
Yeah,
the person. It's the person. Great leaders are great people.
right. That's nice. Well, that's your example in the Anatomy of Love chapter where you talk about someone who invented a device to monitor vital functions that sustain life, to inform medical care in hospitals. And he was moved to do so because his mother went through a condition or an illness and did not have this tool to help her. And
Yeah.
I hear stories about that. Last night I heard a little documentary about someone who was a lawyer in Congress, and he all of a sudden contracted ALS. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, right? So he went on a mission because nobody says there's anything you can do, and people kind of sit with that in the medical. And so he went on this mission to say, well, let's figure it out. And he lived over 10 years. Most people have a couple months to live, and he gathered a lot of people who had that illness and their families and came together to make a difference. And
Yeah.
then he died, right? So this was his mission, to make things better,
Mhm.
and we all have a chance to do that. And you said good leaders are good people, right? Do you want to be a good person? What is a good person,
Yeah.
And where do you want to live from, like you say,
Yeah. Absolutely. Well,
And
I think we should maybe stop on that because that's a really great question for our audience is,
yeah,
where do you want to live from?
yeah.
And what are you willing to do to get there? How will you get there? And it's an incremental journey, obviously.
Yeah,
But
and you end the chapter with that question too, which is great to get people thinking, can you identify true love consciousness within yourself and within your life? Are you being as kind, loving, and generous as you would want to be? And does your environment have the level of love consciousness you want and deserve? So you can just start there at the end of that chapter with those questions and look at your life. Does it? Do I? Good days, bad days, whatever way your mood is swinging. But there's a great clarity in your writing in the book and good questions to get people thinking.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm glad you appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do. Yeah.
I appreciate everything you do with the Love Conscious Human Tribe. Yeah.
Supporting the love. Let it grow.
So thank you, Jamie, for this conversation, and hopefully we'll have some other ones, many more. Why not?
Good. I always enjoy it. Thank you too, Teri.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode from start to finish. It is always a pleasure to reach a fellow love-conscious human. If you want to expand on your consciousness education, check out the book, Flip Your Switch, on Amazon, and the courses on loveconscioushuman.com. Or you can book a private coaching session with me. We hope you'll join us again. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Let's come together to crowdsource a love-conscious world.